The moment Jake turned the faucet, expecting the rush of water, a hollow gurgle met his ears. He frowned, twisting the handle fully. Nothing. A sinking feeling settled in his chest as he moved through the house, checking the bathroom sink, the shower, even the outdoor spigot. Dry. The air was thick with late summer heat, pressing down on him as he stepped outside, heart pounding. That was when he saw it. A bright yellow notice taped to his door in the aggressive slant of bureaucracy: water service terminated due to non-compliance with HOA regulations. Jake ripped it off, his pulse spiking. Non-compliance? What the hell were they talking about? He paid his dues. He maintained his property. Unlike some of his neighbors, his lawn wasn't an overgrown jungle or a barren dust patch. His house wasn't an eyesore. He'd received no prior warning, no letter, no email. Nothing. Then he saw the initials at the bottom of the notice. ***, Karen Holbrook, HOA President, ***. Of course. Karen had been a thorn in his side since the day he moved in. With her rigid posture, perfectly lacquered nails, and ever-present clipboard, she was the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. Always watching, always judging, always finding something to criticize. She had fined people for parking 2 inches over a driveway line, for painting their shutters the wrong shade of blue, for leaving a trash bin visible from the street for more than 20 minutes. She ruled through intimidation, and most of the neighbors either fell in line or lived in fear of her. Jake had never been one to bow. He marched across the street to Karen's house, barely registering the neatly trimmed hedges or the gleaming perfection of her front porch. He knocked, firm and insistent. A few seconds later, the door swung open, and there she was, pristine as ever, her blonde bob frozen in place, a smirk already forming. "Oh, Jake," she said sweetly, tilting her head. "What a surprise. How can I help you?" "You shut off my water," he said, cutting straight to the point. She made a show of gasping. **Me**? Oh no, Jake. The Homeowners Association made that decision." He gritted his teeth. "Based on what?" Her eyes sparkled with amusement. "You violated regulations." "What regulations?" She pulled out her phone, scrolled theatrically, then turned the screen toward him. There, on a document that looked hastily put together, was a citation for failure to maintain property aesthetics in compliance with community standards. Jake blinked. "My property is in compliance." She let out a laugh, feigning sympathy. "Oh, Jake, your lawn? It's patchy. My lawn is fine." Fine isn't perfect," she chirped. "And here at Maplewood Estates, we strive for perfection." "You cut off my water because you don't like my grass?" His voice was sharp now, disbelief and fury laced together. Karen clasped her hands together, enjoying this. "I didn't cut off anything, Jake. The HOA enforces its rules. I simply ensure they're followed." His jaw tightened. "You can't legally do this." "Oh, but I can." She leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "And if I were you, I'd be very careful about how you handle this. The board has the authority to issue fines, place liens. Why, if you're not careful, you could be looking at a foreclosure situation. I'd hate to see that happen." For a moment, rage threatened to consume him. Not just at the audacity, but at the absolute certainty in her voice. The knowledge that she'd done this before, that she'd gotten away with it, that she enjoyed it. "You're out of line," he said, his voice dangerously even. Karen's smirk widened. "And yet here we are." She shut the door in his face. Jake stood there, his fists clenched, breathing through the boiling anger. He could go to the city. He could call a lawyer. But he already knew how that would go. The HOA had its own internal regulations, its own enforcement. And Karen? She had power. He turned back toward his house, jaw set. Fine. She wanted to play games? She had no idea what was coming. The next few days were a lesson in endurance. Jake adapted, but the absence of running water gnawed at his patience. He showered at the gym, filled jugs at a nearby gas station, and rinsed dishes with bottled water. Every inconvenience was a reminder of Karen's smug face, her carefully curated cruelty. But frustration alone wouldn't fix this. He needed a plan. Karen thrived on technicalities, using obscure bylaws as weapons. If he wanted to beat her, he had to think like her, find the leverage she wasn't expecting. He spent the night combing through the HOA's documentation, cross-referencing every rule, every zoning requirement, every city ordinance tied to property management. The more he read, the more something nagged at him. Karen wielded authority like a personal scepter, but HOAs weren't above the law. They operated within legal limits, and if she had overstepped, there had to be consequences. The first crack appeared when he stumbled upon a complaint forum. Other homeowners had run-ins with Karen, fines, threats, even sudden service shutdowns, but few had fought back. Then one comment stood out: "She shut off my water once. I let it go because I couldn't risk the battle, but I always wondered, how does she even have the authority to do that?" That was the question, wasn't it? Jake dug deeper. He checked city regulations on utility control, scanning for clauses on HOA enforcement. That's when he found it. HOAs couldn't tamper with public utilities unless they were responsible for maintaining the water systems themselves. His neighborhood? It wasn't on a private HOA-managed system. It was connected to the city grid. Karen had overstepped. His first move was calling the city. The response was disappointingly predictable. They needed formal proof of improper action. A process. A wait list. Bureaucracy protecting bureaucracy. He hung up, gripping the phone tight. Fine. If the system wouldn't move fast enough, he'd give them something they couldn't ignore. Jake walked the neighborhood, taking note of drainage patterns, street layouts, anything that stood out. He wasn't just looking for violations, he was looking for Karen's mistakes. That's when he noticed it. The storm drains, placed sporadically along the curbs, weren't where they should be. Some sat lower than others, some were partially obstructed by landscaping, and others seemed almost haphazard. He traced the water flow in his mind, picturing heavy rainfall, and suddenly it clicked. The neighborhood's drainage was wrong. Jake sprinted home, pulling up municipal blueprints. He compared them to an older layout he found in public records. Over time, the HOA had altered drainage routes, redirecting runoff toward certain areas, specifically lower-income parts of the neighborhood. It wasn't just bad planning. It was deliberate. Karen had overseen these modifications, adjusting landscaping and rerouting water flow to maintain the visual appeal of her preferred sections of the community. But in doing so, she'd made the entire area vulnerable. This wasn't just an HOA violation. This was a zoning disaster. Jake needed confirmation. The next morning, he knocked on an older neighbor's door, Bill, one of the few people who'd ever dared complain about Karen. He was hesitant at first, but when Jake mentioned the drainage, his eyes darkened. "I always knew she was up to something," Bill muttered, leading Jake to his backyard. "You see that?" He pointed toward a section of his lawn, where the ground dipped unnaturally. "That wasn't there when I moved in. Every time it rains, my yard floods. But when I reported it, the HOA said it was natural shifting." "How long has this been happening?" Jake asked. Bill exhaled sharply. "Years. And it's worse now. The last storm had 6 inches of standing water back here. If that was true, it meant the problem wasn't theoretical. It was active. And worse, it was documented." Jake thanked him, then spent the next few hours knocking on more doors, gathering similar stories. It wasn't just Bill. Multiple homeowners had experienced unexplained pooling water, worsening over the years. That was all he needed. He sent a formal complaint to the city, attaching pictures, documents, and eyewitness statements. But he didn't stop there. He sent copies to local news outlets. And then he waited. 2 days later, a city inspector arrived, clipboard in hand, walking the streets with careful, practiced eyes. Jake watched from his porch as the man studied the curbs, checked elevation points, and took notes. He lingered outside Karen's house longer than anywhere else. An hour later, a second city vehicle pulled up. Then a third. Jake's phone buzzed. A new email, urgent. City review of Maplewood Estates drainage system underway. He didn't even need to open it to know what it meant. Karen had no idea what was coming. Jake stood on his porch, watching the city inspectors comb through the neighborhood with a quiet intensity that sent ripples of unease through the residents. Clipboards in hand, they measured distances, examined storm drains, and exchanged hushed discussions. It wasn't just a routine check, it was a full-scale investigation. Across the street, Karen stood with her arms crossed, her usual smugness faltering at the edges. Her posture was rigid, her jaw tight. She had noticed, of course. She wasn't stupid. But she didn't know it was Jake who had set this in motion. Not yet. By midday, the murmurs had begun. Neighbors who had long been indifferent or fearful of HOA retaliation were watching, whispering. Something big was happening. The inspectors weren't just looking at paperwork. They were measuring flood-prone areas, taking soil samples, reviewing old complaints. Then, just before noon, a fourth vehicle arrived, a city supervisor. That was when Karen finally broke. Jake leaned against his railing as she stormed toward the men in suits, her voice dripping with forced pleasantries. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" One of the inspectors glanced up from his notes, unimpressed. You're Karen Holbrook, correct? HOA president? That's correct, she said smoothly. Is there an issue I should be aware of? The supervisor flipped through his paperwork, barely looking at her. We're responding to multiple complaints regarding illegal modifications to the neighborhood's drainage system. We have reason to believe that certain adjustments have led to improper water redirection, which has created hazardous conditions for several properties. Karen let out a small, breathy laugh. Hazardous? That's ridiculous. Any water issues are simply a result of natural shifts in the land. This is a well-maintained community. I assure you the HOA follows all regulations. The inspector raised an eyebrow. That's so. He turned to one of his colleagues. Show her. A younger city worker unrolled a blueprint on the hood of a nearby truck. This, he said, pointing, is the original drainage plan for Maplewood Estates. And this, he placed a newer diagram beside it, is what we found after reviewing the changes made over the last decade. Karen barely glanced at them. I don't see the issue. The issue, the supervisor said, tapping a section in red ink, is that these modifications don't match any approved city plans. Your HOA has been rerouting water without permits, resulting in multiple properties now sitting in areas that flood excessively. Karen's carefully controlled expression twitched. That's absurd. The inspector didn't flinch. It's also illegal. A hush spread across the street. A few homeowners, sensing an opportunity, stepped closer, listening. Jake saw Bill watching from his yard, arms folded, a slow grin forming. Karen shifted her stance. If there were changes, they were done to protect property values. To enhance the neighborhood. I don't understand why this is suddenly an issue. The younger inspector flipped to another page. It became an issue when it started violating flood zoning laws. Karen blinked. Flood zoning? The supervisor nodded. Your modifications have artificially created a new risk zone. If these results hold, the city may have to officially classify Maplewood Estates as a flood-prone area. Jake saw the exact moment the words landed. Karen paled. Wait, she said quickly, her voice tightening, you're saying? I'm saying, the supervisor interrupted, that if this community is declared a flood zone, insurance premiums will skyrocket. Property values will drop. Homeowners will be forced to obtain additional coverage. And if we find that this was caused by unauthorized HOA actions, well, he exhaled, shaking his head. There will be consequences. A ripple of panic coursed through the growing crowd. Several homeowners exchanged alarmed looks. Someone muttered, my insurance is already high enough. Karen straightened, forcing confidence into her tone. This is absurd. There must be some mistake. I will personally review all HOA records and get to the bottom of this. The supervisor gave her a blank look. You do that. He turned to his team. Full report by end of the week. We'll determine next steps once we verify liability. Karen stood frozen as the city officials packed up, their presence lingering in the air like a coming storm. Jake let the moment settle, let her feel it, the slow unraveling of everything she had so carefully constructed. Then as Karen turned back toward her house, he caught her eye. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked genuinely afraid. And Jake? He smiled. Karen was unraveling. 4 days she fought to control the narrative, but panic had set in and cracks were showing. Homeowners who once feared her now whispered in corners, their resentment no longer hidden. News of the impending flood zone designation had spread, and panic turned to fury as people realized what it meant. Higher insurance rates, devalued property, thousands of dollars in unexpected costs, all because of her. The town hall meeting was supposed to be her way to contain the fire. It only threw gasoline on it. Jake arrived early, taking a seat near the back. The room buzzed with tension, neighbors murmuring in hushed, angry tones. Karen stood at the front, shoulders squared, a brittle confidence plastered on her face. She tapped the microphone, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Let's get started, she said, her voice clipped. I want to address the recent concerns about the drainage system and some misconceptions regarding potential flood zoning. A hand shot up. Is it true, a man interrupted, voice laced with barely contained fury, that you altered the water flow without city approval? Karen's smile twitched. The HOA made changes to improve aesthetics and... Another voice cut in. So you admit it? You did this. Murmurs grew louder. Karen held up a hand. I understand that this has caused some uncertainty, but we don't have confirmation of any zoning changes yet. Jake stood. We will soon. The room turned. Karen's gaze locked onto his, sharp as glass. Excuse me? Jake held up his phone, tapping the screen. The city's final report is going live in 3 minutes. They've already confirmed that the modifications were unauthorized and in violation of municipal codes. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. A woman gasped. Someone cursed under their breath. Karen's mask cracked. That's not possible. Jake walked forward, slow and deliberate, voice calm but lethal. It is. The rerouting you approved created artificial flood zones. When the designation becomes official, this entire community will be classified as high risk. He glanced at the crowd. That means tripled insurance rates, mandatory flood coverage and possible fines from the city. All because Karen wanted control. Chaos erupted. What the hell? You knew about this? Asterisk, you lied to us, asterisk. Karen tried to raise her hands but the noise drowned her out. Homeowners were on their feet now, shouting over one another, fury mounting like a breaking dam. Bill stepped forward, voice booming. So what happens now? What do we do? Jake turned back to Karen, watching her unravel in real time. She was cornered, scrambling for an out, but there wasn't one. Then the final blow came. A woman near the front, holding her phone, gasped. She's on the news. A murmur of confusion swept the room. Then, someone played a video on speaker. A local news anchor's voice rang out. Asterisk, the HOA president of Maplewood Estates, Karen Holbrook, is facing backlash after an investigation revealed unauthorized drainage alterations that may lead to the neighborhood being classified as a flood zone. Residents are now demanding accountability, with some calling for her immediate resignation. Asterisk. Karen paled. The news. The entire city knew. The room turned deadly silent. Everyone was watching her now, waiting. Jake stepped closer, voice steady. The HOA can't survive this. You're finished, Karen? She swallowed hard. You should resign, someone called. Yes, another voice snapped. Resign. The chant caught fire. Resign. Resign. Karen's breath hitched. Her perfect world, her carefully built empire, was collapsing in real time. She turned as if searching for allies, but there were none. She had ruled through fear. And fear had turned on her. Her lips parted, but no words came. Finally, she exhaled sharply, her shoulders slumping. Fine. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I resign. A cheer erupted, people clapping, some laughing in disbelief. Jake just smiled. It was over. Karen's reign had drowned in the flood she created.